Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Logos. Today's episode is a bit of a surprise. I didn't plan on it last night, but I asked Logos if he'd watch the video that I did last night with Aleksay and Florian about philosophy of mind, epiphenomenalism, and so on. That video was more to just figure out where we all stood, because it wasn't necessarily clear to me where we all stood, because there was a series of questions we plan to address in our roundtables in the future this year that hinge very importantly on how we think mind is, what we think mind is. And I asked Logos to watch it to sort of clarify, as he's very good at doing, and also unpacking some of these ideas. So to sort of run with that, Logos did a lot of work. We don't want it to go to waste. So why don't you explain, Logos, what you got for us tonight?
Yeah, I have a really short slideshow presentation. It shouldn't take too much time, so we have a good chunk of the hour to talk about whatever about philosophy of mind after. But in listening to the discussion, there are some things I heard that were just kind of eyebrow raising to me, that people seem to take for granted in the discussion. And I was like, that just doesn't seem right. I think we should address that. And I'm hoping some of these clarifications will help with better discussions in the future. Um, because there are some conflations I saw. It's mainly meant to be general. This isn't like an AAR or anything like that. I'm not going to go point by point in the discussion, respond to anything. These are more like broad stroke stuff I saw that I'm just like, I gotta say something about this one, and I got some free time, so what the hell? Let's get the gang back together. Um, so I guess with that, I'll just jump right in. So dualism, what is it? Because one of the biggest things that I heard uh, misconstrued, I think, in the discussion is what exactly dualism is. Um, and it's really easy to do, but we'll get into it. So the basic idea of dualism is in the word. Dualism means two substances. The first is the physical, the second is the non-physical. Both work together to produce consciousness in the model. You don't just pick the non-physical one and say that's where consciousness is. You don't just pick the brain and say that's where consciousness is. If you pick either one of them, that's called monism. If it's just the immaterial mind stuff, that's idealism. If you just pick the physical stuff, that could be anything from physicalism to panpsychism. There's all sorts of ways to interpret physicalist monism because, shocker, that's the most popular one if you're going to be a monist, given the state of our society, as you've mentioned on Twitter. But dualism rejects both monisms. You need both at the same time in the same place working together to get the whole person. Um, so the point here is, or the last point I want to say here is, I can't think of any facts. I kept seeing like, if you're an empiricist, you shouldn't believe X because there's no evidence and whatnot in the discussion. Dualism is more of an interpretive framework than it is a postulate about like an entity, like an electron. Um, and so what it's going to do is it's going to take whatever data you find, uh, observed, neuroscience, sociology, whatever, and it will have a way of interpreting the data we're all seeing together. Maybe there's some data you can find that will be inconsistent, but it's not going to be as easy as some of the examples I was seeing in the discussion. So I think that's worth looking out for. Um, so the implications of what we just talked about here. Dualism predicts we will not have out-of-body experiences. Why? I mean, why do you think that is, Todd? Why would I say the first bullet point?
Well, actually, yeah, we talked about this in Discord, because the two, at least in a human, right, would need to be both working together at the same time.
Exactly. And one of the things I heard in the discussion was, if dualism is true, we would predict out of body experiences. The empirical evidence for out of body experience is really shaky, therefore, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, no, idealists would predict out of body experiences because they think mind over matter. They think mind is fundamental and matter is some kind of epiphenomenal construct. A lot of idealists are kind of like implicitly like reverse epiphenomenalists, where the brain and the body, sorry, are the epiphenomenal, strata on top of the mental one. Uh, Josh Rasmussen flirts around with this stuff on Twitter a bit about this. It's kind of interesting to see him play with both sides. Um, yeah, so dualism does not predict mind over matter. Dualism may entail a hardware software view in which consciousness is transferable, say the beetle in the box, but it doesn't have to. Let's say the particularity of what makes you you is in your body. And so these type of maybe hylomorphic dualists at closer to the extreme end of this spectrum, they might actually deny the beetle in the box thought experiment, because what makes you the whole person and having the conscious experiences you have and so on is part of your brain. Your brain is necessary to make you you, even if there's immaterial stuff as well. Um, but you could be, say, a Cartesian dualist that's fully on board with like beetle in the box stuff. So there was the discussion about transference, and dualism may or may not. There's a spectrum of dualism, just like there's a spectrum of physicalisms. Um, so dualism is not disconfirmed by empirical evidence and would be consistent with the same empirical evidence as other models, so far as I've seen. Um, that's kind of a bolder claim. I could be proven wrong on that. We'll see. Okay. The next quick thing is a word about Occam's razor, because I saw this come up over and over and over again, and this one raised eyebrows a little bit for me. So Occam's razor is about preferring explanations with the fewest assumptions, i.e. parsimony. It does not care whether entities used in explanations exists. For example, instrumentalists in philosophy of science can use Occam's razor too. So what is an instrumentalist?
I don't know.
So we have a bunch of entities in our physical models. Maybe way back when it was electrons, now we're much more advanced. We have Higgs boson particles and quarks and all sorts of crazy things, and they're used as kind of like the knobs that work with the math in our models to kind of like make our very elaborate predictions. Now, an instrumentalist might say some of these things we cannot observe directly. As technology is getting better, some we can. We smash the things into each other. We think we see the particles or something akin to them. We don't have to. Instrumentalists say maybe the things we're talking about in our models at a deep level don't really exist. But what they are is they're objects that help us tell a really good story. And because the predictions the story makes are so good, it turns out they're, quote, indispensable for the good predictions we make about the world, and so we keep them around. Now, if you're wow, man, my voice is really cracking up. I'm sorry, the air around here is really dry. I've been trying to drink water, but it's tough. So if you're an instrumentalist, you can still rely on the question of more and fewer entities in Occam's razor questions. You don't have to worry about whether or not these things empirically exist. And so I saw comments in there about we don't have good reason to think the immaterial part of dualism exists, and therefore it violates Occam's razor, something along those lines. And my comment is instrumentalists can use Occam's razor too, so that's not really a bother. Occam's razor is about intermodal comparisons and which one's simpler given they explain the same thing. It doesn't really mind what ontological status you give to the objects in the model. That's basically the sum of the last two bullet points, so we'll move on. So what are the implications of this? So dualism can be said to run afoul of Occam's razor if a competing theory with exactly the same explanatory scope and power, but fewer assumptions exists. This accusation is tantamount to saying that dualists assume the immaterial for no reason, given they get no explanatory payoff for doing so. But dualists would claim there are explanatory gaps in rival theories that they think their theory fulfills, or they fill the holes. So these assumptions are too hasty. And what I mean by too hasty here is before you can accuse somebody of being not parsimonious, of being superfluous with their entities, you want to make sure that your model that removes them explains the same stuff in the same way without any weird, odd stuff that happens, right? You may be making a trade-off you don't see in removing an entity. It's kind of like the scientific version of G.K. Chesterton's fence, to put it another way. Okay, so here's an example of a rival theory, Epiphenomenalism, because it just happened to come up in the conversation, but without it, we could have picked any one of them. Right, so Epiphenomenalism says that brains produce conscious experiences as a byproduct, which does not itself causally act on brains. So the analogy I like to give for this is cars, when they're driving on the road, they kind of blow off exhaust, and the exhaust doesn't then come back and say, push the car or turn the car or act on the car as it's driving on the road. The exhaust just kind of floats around the car like a little cloud. And that's kind of what the conscious experiences are like, produced by your brain states.
But real quick, a
Sure.
good similar example is from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They use a statement by Thomas Henry Huxley And I quote, according to the famous analogy of Thomas Henry Huxley, the relationship between mind and brain is like the relationship between the steam whistle, which accompanies the work of a locomotive engine, and the engine itself, just as the steam whistle is caused by the engine's operations but has no causal influence upon it. So too, the mental is caused by the workings of neurophysiological mechanisms but has no causal influence upon their operation.
There you go. Leave it to Huxley. Okay, so this theory posits the brain alone as the explanation for consciousness, and so posits one less entity. It's a physical monist theory rather than a dualist one. And so they want to say, hey, I'm only positing one thing, you're positing two, I win, but not so fast. Right? In order for Occam's razor to work in its favor, it must explain our conscious experience with no explanatory gaps. If it turns out they've given up something in losing that second entity, they may have a problem. Okay, so the usual problem I see pointed out to about epiphenomenalism is a pairing problem. So an example of a pairing problem, well, a pairing problem in general is when two things are naturally assumed to go together in philosophy, but a theory can't give an account for why, and there should really be given an account for why. And I'll start with one against dualism to show you how they work and show them not like trying to be biased or anything here. So a pairing problem against dualism would say that there's no reason for an immaterial aspect of consciousness to attach to a brain at a particular point in space-time, right? Because immaterial things are not dependent on, contingent on, pick your grounding relation of choice, any physical point in space-time, and yet my material mind is following me around, my physical brain around at each point in space-time it occupies. Isn't that kind of interesting? And so they point to that as a problem that dualism has in positing this immaterial thing that kind of helps out the physical with consciousness. So the solution I use to this problem is I use the MMO analogy, right? So the body is like an MMO avatar, and the immaterial mind is kind of like you behind the keyboard controlling the avatar. So if you behind the keyboard aren't an object in the MMO world, you don't occupy a point in space-time, you're not bits on a server, you're not anything, whatever, but you're helping move the character around and do all that stuff. You could be anywhere on the server, hypothetically, but you're with that one single character. Well, why is that? Well, because it's your avatar. And so if there's a view of dualism kind of like that, where there is some sense in which there's ownership of the physical point in space-time, your brain, then that ownership relationship doesn't have to be like a spatiotemporal dependence. It can be a non-spatiotemporal dependence in the same way that you don't have to be in the server to own your MMO character on the server. That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. So the pairing problem for epiphenomenalism is that even though conscious experiences aren't causal on brain states, they still happen to correspond to brain states unless we think there's an issue. A healthy correspondence between the two is the default explanation. Why? Well, consider someone going to pick fruit from a tree, but the tree looks, sounds, smells like a giant T-Rex. You can smell its terrible breath. You hear it kind of growling, swaying about, right? Imagine you walk up to a swaying T-Rex and just grab a chunk out of it, and the chunk turns out to be an apple, and you bite into it and just kind of walk away. I mean, everybody would kind of look at that scenario and just be kind of repulsed, or they'd be very uneasy watching it. Yeah, I mean, even though it was hard, no skeptic probably would admit to themselves they'd have to be. But why is that, right? If this person's sensory data of the T-Rex is just kind of like a whistle, an exhaust, a byproduct of what their brain's doing, and their brain's just telling them go pick an apple, it doesn't really matter that the brain's command go pick an apple is accompanied by the tree they're picking an apple from looking like a T-Rex, or if it's accompanied by the tree looking like an apple tree. The body is going to carry out the command all the same because the brain is the only causal thing here, and it's given the command. So it can have any byproduct it wants. The command will still be followed. So why is it the case? Why is it the case that the byproduct we happen to pair with what our brains tell us to do happens most of the time? The healthy assumption is that it should, unless we, concoct an optical illusion or some way to trick ourselves, as I'm sure they'll come up with examples abound. But the default assumption usually is it's reasonable to expect that we're doing what we're doing. Our brain's telling us to pick apples because we see an apple tree, not a T-Rex. So that's the pairing problem, is instead of pairing, say, an immaterial thing to a point in space-time, we're now pairing brain states with the outcomes they produce as byproducts, and we're wondering why it is we expect them to match all the time when we're behaving like rational human beings.
Right. So to interject here real quick,
Sure.
I like what you've done here, right? Because one side, usually the materialist or physicalist side, will like to say that they don't have a pairing problem, the dualist does, but they really all have pairing problems, or rather the appearance of pairing problems. And then the question becomes, what do you find? What are your priors, right? What seems more plausible to you prior to entering into this discussion?
Right.
That will determine whether you think this is a pairing problem or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure that all of the physicalist ones have pairing problems. I've seen this one used against epiphenomenalism, and the reason it can be is because conscious states are byproducts that aren't themselves causal, and so your brain can make you do what it wants, and you're going to observe whatever you observe along doing it, and there's no connection between what you observe and what you're told to do. But let's suppose you're like a limitivist, and so like you just say consciousness just is what your brain states, whatever. And so those people will say that you see the apple tree and go to pick apples because it's all one and the same brain state of your body, being hungry and telling you to pick apples. It wouldn't tell you to do so unless it sent something. And it wouldn't tell you to do something unless it sent something. And it's all kind of the same bundled packaged experience. There's no degree of separation there, like with epiphenomenalism, that'll kind of get you there.
Well, just to interject real quick, I guess what I'm
Mhm.
saying by that is there is still a pairing problem. They're trying to cut the knot and say that there isn't by producing an equivalency, but then that produces a whole set of other problems. The idea that mental and brain states are identical, right? So it's looking at the pairing problem and just sort of like quote unquote cutting the Gordian knot, but it still creates a whole bunch of other problems along with it.
Yeah, and this is why I was talking earlier about the question of parsimony versus trade-offs, right? You've only achieved parsimony if removing an entity from your explanation hasn't come with trade-offs that make your explanations really, really difficult. So if it turns out that removing the mental part, if you're an epiphenomenalist, say, gives you this weird pairing problem that you otherwise wouldn't have had, I'll get to that in a second, um, uh, then you can't say to be more simple or more parsimonious by cutting out the variable because you just made your life complicated another way. You've made a trade, and people can either make that trade or not. They're not just being straightforwardly irrational or needlessly complicated by keeping the second variable.
Yes.
Okay. So, because under epiphenomenalism, a conscious state is produced as a byproduct of brain states, there's no compelling reason that the conscious experience need resemble what the brain is actually having the body do, because the brain doesn't act according to its conscious experiences. You can walk up to a T-Rex and pluck an apple right from its bosom. It doesn't care. If the brain knows there's an apple there and tells it there's an apple there, go pick the apple from that T-Rex, man. You have a blast. Okay, so there's an explanatory gap. Why we expect our experiences to match what our brains have us do, which is not explained by epiphenomenalism, but is explained by dualism. For example, intent, which is usually where the mental is located for a dualist, is somewhere around intent. When I see arguments against reductive materialisms and stuff like that, the more sophisticated ones really are about intent. The Chinese room problem is about intent, things like that. Mary's room is about knowledge, but interestingly enough, I think what's being attacked in Mary's room is justification for justified true belief, and justification has kind of intentional component. Um, so I think intent is what most of them end up having in common. I digress. Um, so intent necessitates an accurate view of the world to make decisions. We could not decide to pick the fruit if the tree looks like a T-Rex rather than a tree, and so we would expect no mismatch to occur. We're going to, the entire dualist model is we take input from our brain. It's a necessary instrument for us doing what we need to do. Our eyes are functioning, our ears are functioning, whatever. They give us information. We're going to act on it subconsciously. There's no question. The example of the batter and other examples given by your other co-host during your discussion. Totally noted. Those subconscious ways we act are also going to inform how we then make conscious choices later on top of all that complexity. Um, but because we need to have a roughly accurate model of the world to make the choices we make, we expect these things to work. And when people make bad choices because they have bad information, say they're hallucinating, we consider that irrational behavior and we try to fix the hallucinations on top of that. So there you go. So dualism does not have this problem. And so it turns out that the second variable might be advantageous compared to removing it. Okay, one more issue. So this one is what I thought of long after I wrote you that post last night. I had a PSR argument. I'm going to keep that on the back burner because it goes into some weird places I haven't fully contemplated yet. But this one I think is straightforward. Um, so consider the possibilities in which one is having a good dream or a nightmare while sleeping, because y'all were talking about like having a nightmare and kicking in your dreams and things like that. So ostensibly, first problem aside, there are distinct brain states producing these outcomes as byproducts. Call them BG and BN, so the brain state for a good dream, the brain state for a nightmare. Either BG and BN are nominalistic fictions of convenience, in which case is it really the case that N is produced by BN and vice versa, or are B, G, and Bn real distinctions, and the existence of G and N carve the space of B in person P at natural joints. Natural joints are where real distinctions are made in nature, where categories are real, make sense, and aren't just arbitrary conventions we can hand wave away without expecting nature to kind of like, bite back. You've heard that phrase, right? Carving nature at the joints.
No, but I know, but the way you've described it, these kinds of uh, things that are real differences, not merely human convention, are. Yeah, I mean, I understand that.
Okay. So if the latter, what we just said, it seems there is bidirectional causality in that G and N entail a natural distinction on the brain states themselves, right? So all we have on the epiphenomenalist model is brain states are doing things, and we are seeing outcomes come of those brain states. Those outcomes, the whistle, the smog, the whatever, could be good dreams, they could be nightmares, they could be whatever. So we have this Pandora's box of brain states producing these effects. But it turns out, let's say we're a psychiatrist and our patient is having nightmares every night and they can't sleep and it's ruining their life and we need to fix it. Maybe there's medication we can give them. Maybe there's electromagnetic therapy. Maybe there's something we can do to their brain to get them to stop having nightmares. Well, we have to figure out the nightmare causing brain states, and we have to have some idea of what the good dream causing brain states might look like in order to fix the problem at the physiological level. And so we have this natural division now of brain states we want to avoid and brain states we want to have. But how do we get there? Well, we have to do experiment. We have to actually like have them sleep. And if there's a good night where they have a good dream, maybe we do like an MRI of their brain and okay, that's what their good dream brain states look like. And the other nights where they have nightmares, okay, that's what the bad states look like we want to avoid. Now it's interesting because the good dreams, the nightmares have kind of like ontologically carved the brain states, the space of them at the joints, so that we can actually like do this treatment. But it's supposed to be that brain states only cause the outcomes. But what we have is a philosophical model where the outcomes are helping us partition the brain states. So there is a two-way causality there. What they try to clarify, I think, is that it's not mechanistic causality, i.e., the dream states aren't mechanistically causing something in the brain. The mechanism's still going one way, but the mechanism is still kind of like a grounding or correlative relationship that still divides things. At that point, maybe I had to say this in the other slide. Yeah. Okay, let me hold up, say this, and I'll come right back, right? So what we had in the other slide is a dilemma, right? There's an or there. The first or, the nominalistic or, undermines the question of whether certain brain states are causing dreams and nightmares because the idea that these brain states cause nightmares and these cause good dreams, it was a nominalistic these and those that didn't actually exist. If it's a nominalistic these and those that doesn't actually exist, whence are coming these effects that are definitely observable and causing harm to people? Um, so you can't really accept that horn of the dilemma. That just doesn't work. The other horn, getting back to what we were just talking about, right? Um, you have this now cause where you've kind of carved up the space of brain states as a result of the effects they're producing. Um, and so you can try to say, yeah, it's causal but not mechanistic. But now you're kind of adding loops to it, like Ptolemy's old model, right? And the more questions you start asking, it's mechanistic, but it's not that. It's causal, but it's not mechanistic. Okay, it's causal in this other way, but it's not mechanistic in this other way. And eventually, you start making a bunch of what's the word I'm looking for? Not excuses, but close caveats. Basically, the caveats will start adding up and become entities in your model all their own, and so it'll actually be um, brain plus a bunch of corollaries or caveats on causality to underpin epiphenomenalism's use of the term that will then explain this. And once you add up all the caveats plus the brain, is that simpler than just the two substances? I don't know. So even barring the first problem, we have this other problem where I don't know if we can maintain parsimony and maintain the unidirectional causality of epiphenomenalism. So that's another interesting case.
So real quick,
Sure.
I'm trying to think of this word and I can't. And maybe if I define it for you, you can help me.
Sure.
In philosophy, and I think also in law, there's a word that describes an assumption which lacks independent
Ad hoc.
verification. Ad hoc. That's the word you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because what you're doing is you're inventing these ad hoc explanations to keep the theory going, but lack independent verification.
Yeah. Because the other person can always just say, it's just like, look, man, when I care about the causal relationship between brain states and mental states, I think about it in the most direct terms. And what you want to say is it's something like, well, it's not mechanistically causal, but it's this other kind of causal, and blah 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 blah. It's like, notably, dualism, doesn't necessarily say there's a mechanistic relationship between the immaterial and the material. There's some kind of causal and maybe correlative and maybe whatever relationship between them, but a lot of them don't commit to a mechanistic one. So whether the cause isn't mechanistic ultimately isn't relevant. It might turn out the cause is bidirectional in the same generic sense that dualists mean it once you ask the right questions. So yeah, I don't like to jump to ad hoc unless I really have to, but the shoe might fit. That's always a good avenue to explore. So the conclusion: there are reasons to reject dualism. I do, though I used to believe it. Um, Empirical evidence, Occam's razor / parsimony are not good reasons to reject dualism. We see rival theories attempting parsimony lose explanatory power scope. Trading simplicity for explanatory power scope does not result in parsimony. It results in a trade-off. And once you have that, you're not irrational for making one trade or the other. Losing parsimony only happens if you're adding things and you get no benefit for doing so. So that's basically it for the slideshow.
So, okay, now I guess this is not strictly speaking relevant, but I'm a little curious now. Then where do you fall? Because you don't sound like a physicalist. And you have said before, because I've said that, well, deism or pantheism is a kind of theism. So you'll call yourself a theist. Does that mean you're kind of idealist?
No, I don't really like idealism because it's not exactly clear how you get from the mental to the physical. I think we have direct apprehensions of the physical, so I would say I'm some kind of physicalist, but not one of the usual ones. I don't. I'm still doing research between two kinds to see what the differences are because they sound really similar, but I guess they're not the same. There's one kind called property dualistic physicalism, and there's one called like dual aspect physicalism. And so it's going to boil down to the difference between like properties and aspects. But what it boils down to me is this: um, there's one substance doing most of the causal work. Immaterial things in our experience usually are like abstract objects, so they're not causally active anyway. And so it's very plausible that the physical stuff in our heads are going to have these irreducible, immaterial properties that you just can't do away with. They're indispensable for thinking about our best minds. And I definitely think this for ethics. Our previous live streams about my thought experiments and stuff are still valid. Everything I've said is still informing how I think about these theories. The ethics of mind control and things like that are front and center when I think about this question. I think that even if you're a physicalist, you're going to have to attach an immaterial property of some kind to it. To safeguard against things like mind control. There are natural joints in nature that are like, here's the brain states Todd is supposed to have. Here are brain states that the state could enforce on Todd using drugs and medication or whatever, that they shouldn't do, right? It's ethically wrong for them to do. And so you want to have properties attached to those brain states that will facilitate those kind of ethical sentences. I think something with that at minimum is non-negotiable, and I'm probably going to get closer to being back to dualism than that. I just don't know how to get there.
Fair enough. This is, again, that wasn't even the main point of this
Oh,
discussion. I was
sure.
just curious. So, one thing I want to ask is, when you said dualism does not entail a mind over matter or a post physical existence, are you then saying that, like, say, the Christian conception of reality isn't dualist, or that not all dualisms require that?
Not all dualisms require that.
Okay, that's what I thought you were saying.
Yeah, dualism doesn't entail it, but there are dualisms consistent with it.
Right. So what I would say is that I believe in a dualism that does entail it, but not because I'm a dualist, but because of other independent reasons.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
And the analogy to use for that, since the MMO analogy ends up being like so useful for thinking about dualism, um, let's talk anime for a second. Sword Art Online Season 1. So in Sword Art Online Season 1, there's this idea where you go into the game and you're so what happens is, I don't know if I've told you about this, but all these people kind of go into the game, and it's the grand opening of the game, and the maker of the game shows up and he goes, hey, congratulations, thank you for playing my game, it's grand opening, and you're now permanently comatose, you're trapped here, and if you die in real life, have fun, basically. And that's like how the first episode starts. Now my point to that is to say that one type of dualism would just be to say that situation in Sword Art Online is the thing. It's your physical person and the you controlling it that makes you in the MMO world. When you die in the world, you die in real life, right? The you in the pod controlling the character even outside the server, it goes right along with you because it's your physical person that's indispensable for making you. Now, after season 1, that lift is gone. The world's free. Spoilers. People can log in and out to the game at will, and so forth. And so the idea is, well, now if you die in the game, there's still a you that you pop back to outside the game world, and you're just chilling, doing you stuff, and you can maybe log back in or do whatever. And so that would be the more Christian kind of soul kind of dualism. And so that's a good analogy for understanding both of them.
well, wouldn't the Matrix also be dualism number one?
You bet. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. You die in the Matrix, you die in real life.
Yeah.
And of course, Neo is trying to destroy the Matrix, or at least restructure it so that it's a whole different thing.
Yeah, how interesting is it that the Matrix flips dualism on its head, huh? So in like Sword Art Online, you're a physical person asleep controlling a fictional MMO character. Um, no, I guess it is still the same flip. You're a physical person asleep in a virtual. Yeah, no, I thought it was flipped for a second, where like a virtual person's controlling a physical body. That doesn't make much sense. But I've seen a movie with that premise. I got to think about what it is.
Well, that's not the Matrix,
It's not
but
the Matrix. Yeah, I'm confusing with something else.
okay. So this is just a point of clarification I'd like to ask you, because on a substance dualist perspective like mine, I would argue, the epiphenomenalist claims that mental states cause nothing, and I'm like, well, we know they cause other mental states. So the chain of reasoning, right?
Yeah,
Reasoning through the syllogism A then B, B then C, A then C.
right.
No recourse needs to be made to any external physical reality where this man is reasoning through this argument. Now, in that regard, there's no state change. It's all in the mental. Whereas an epiphenomenalist has to have a state change, brain to mental, brain to mental, brain to mental.
Right.
That would be like going from water to ice. So ipso facto, that's more complex than my explanation. Because
Yeah.
my explanation does not require a state change.
Yeah, so trying to steel man the epiphenomenalist model with the syllogism thing, it's going to look something like this. Um, your brain is going to read a bunch of symbols on the paper, and it's probably going to have an unconscious response to the symbols on the paper. Either it's seen them before, it's seen something like them before, It can associate letters with vowels, whatever scaffolding you've kind of done up to that point, and they're going to think of it all in terms of like associations. Think like John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill thought that all math eventually scaffolded back down to sense data. In order to do addition, you just like counted physical blocks or something. And then eventually you're doing multiplication because you're thinking of it as abstracted addition. Um, but if you want to know what multiplication is, you can ontologically work your way back to counting the physical blocks. They're going to think about reading propositions the same way. You associate letters with syllables, with things, with whatnot. And so you read a bunch of words in a syllogism. Your brain is going to make some connection subconsciously, and then it's going to like produce this mental effect along with the connection, right? So what you think about as reasoning about a premise is really um, I don't want to say an illusion because they're not illusionists, but it's kind of like your experience is a byproduct of your brain's subconscious uh, apprehending of the symbols on the page, right? So it's all physical, and then atemporally identical with the physical is like your brain's kind of like epiphany about those symbols. And then because it takes time to process stuff, you can only process through so many chunks per second. Your brain's kind of like a computer. You're gonna read through a chunk, do it, read through a chunk, do it, read through a chunk, do it. And then what's gonna happen is your brain is going to chunk those all together because ostensibly your brain is telling your body to read this for a purpose. You don't do it, your brain does it, right? Um, and so because you have to chunk all this together, you then are going to produce this complex byproduct as a response that is the quote chain of reasoning through all these syllogisms. Um, and so like, yeah, you can talk like that, but you're right. It's really complicated. I mean, I don't know if anybody that thinks themselves of doing anything like that when they're saying that. And of course, they're going to say, well, I mean, well, that doesn't mean it's false. And it's simpler. And then
No, but it does run afoul of Occam's razor.
yeah, it assumes less entities, but you're right. You're now having to refer back to more nodes and kind of how a system works to explain a much simpler system using two entities. So do you want a more complex system using fewer building blocks? Or do you want a simpler system using two? A good example of this would be like a theorem of arithmetic, right? So you could use like second order propositions, maybe even just one, to construct arithmetic in like very, very few assumptions. But if you want to use like first order logic, I think somebody finally did it, unless I misunderstood the article I read, and it turned out to be like a lot um, to do it because it was like chunky first order propositions. Now, in one sense, second order propositions take as objects first order, so they're more complicated. And so it's like, whoa, you've assumed first order propositions and these complicated things called second order ones. What gives? It's like, yeah, but look how simple I made these axioms by doing it, and look how complicated yours were by not. It's something analogous to that.
Right. And we have another problem. Now let's say that we have, using the epiphenomenal framework, okay? We have, because we'll use the steam whistle because I think that's a helpful analogy that Huxley gives. So let's say we have the steam coming from the whistle, which is the result of the locomotive. So we have brain state A, which causes mental state A, and then brain state B, which causes mental state B, and then brain state C, which causes mental state C. Now, A, B, and C in the brain states are all causally connected, and we can demonstrate that through studying the brain.
Sure.
But notice I'm talking about a line of reasoning.
Yeah.
There is no reason to think that A, B, or C would be related together in any non-trivial way on that framework, but they are.
Yeah.
Because it's a line of reasoning. Ipso facto, by the fact of the analogy, they are connected, and we all know that. So then the question is, do we have any reason to believe that they would be on an epiphenomenalist framework? And I don't see that.
Yeah, and that comes back to the pairing problem, right? We read the syllogism and we have the apprehension that we're reasoning through the syllogism. And what they want to say is, as we're chunking our way through the syllogism, our brain's producing these effects. But the effects that our brain produces don't have to be us reasoning through it. They could be all sorts of other things relating to the proposition. Um, and so why is it that we're having the sensation of reasoning rather than some other sensation that doesn't matter? It's invariant because it doesn't affect us. The brain's going to do what the brain's going to do, and it's going to do it regardless of the sensations that it spits out that we experience after the fact, or as a byproduct. Um, so yeah, you've kind of refound the pairing problem using syllogisms rather than T-Rex and the fruit.
Well, the reason why I did this, right, is I want to strike at the key claim of phenomenalism that mental states don't cause other mental states, don't cause anything, rather.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's a pairing problem from the mental state to the brain state to some physical reality. I want to avoid that because that's a separate problem.
Mm-hmm.
The bare claim that mental states do not cause anything, but are merely kind of like letting off steam. So, well, first of all, that's a bad analogy because what is steam? It's a form of heat being radiated out, and it still has an effect on the broader environment.
On the broader environment, yeah, not the train. Absolutely.
Right. But that's not what epiphenomenalism claims. It claims that it has no effect on anything.
Yeah.
So this is my rationalization, okay? Is that if you take a pure material modus position, right? You go full autism on the physical world, and we see that in the last 200 years. If you go full, idealism, right? That would be sort of like Hegel versus Marx, right? Marxism condemned the idealists. That would be like the right Hegelians. You go all autism on the mind, or like the Buddhists or the Hindus, right? And so you learn a lot about that. The problem is what I think a lot of people, at least for me, and I think a lot of people feel this way, is there's something that's unsatisfying about either one of those monisms because you end up leaving a lot of things out, and you just end up waving your hands about the things you can't explain. Now, then you might say, well, okay, dualism attempts to explain both realities, but then it runs into a pairing problem. And I'm like, okay, sure, but what's more of a problem? Pretending that the other half of the universe doesn't exist, or attempting to demonstrate that they can somehow coexist together while acknowledging both of their existences? I think that's less difficult to justify and has fewer assumptions. Otherwise, you just got to hand wave half the universe away.
Yeah, and that's a problem I'm running into because so I'll just give you a rough sketch of the argument that I ran into, which caused me to ultimately like abandon dualism because I ultimately convinced myself out of it trying to defend it. So I came with the MMO analogy to kind of like solve the pairing problem, solve the interaction problem, solve all these problems that people are throwing at it. And the analogy was just working so well until I got to a really central question, right? So aside from players and MMOs, what else are there?
Besides, there's NPCs.
NPCs. And so the question is, if you see something out in the wild, right, and you don't have like a HUD display to tell you what's a player and what's an NPC, how do you know what's a player and what's an NPC? This ends up being a really tricky question. And so here's basically how I get there when thinking about dualism. So you think something if and only if you have a brain state that thinks something, right? That's too strong. That's basically physicalism. And so you're going to want to give some half of the if and only if up. And so the question is, what are dualists going to be willing to give up? So it's like, are they going to be okay with saying, if you think something, then there's a brain state? Or are they going to say, like, if you have a brain state, then you think something? Or to see what it is, let's negate them, right? So if you lack a brain state, then you won't think something. If you don't think something, there's no brain state. I haven't worded that quite right. The point is, let's just explore this for a second because I might still have flu brain. Maybe you can help get me on board here. So we know the if and only if thoughts to brain states is too strong. So what are your thoughts on this one as a dualist? Which branch would you think you'd accept?
Wait, so I'm being offered a dilemma here. Can you briefly rephrase that?
Yeah. So we know that you intend to do something. Let's say Todd intends to go on stream today, right? If and only if Todd has a brain state that tells him he's going to go on stream today. That's too strong because it's kind of like strongly associating your thought with the brain state in a way it's an if and only if identity, basically. So you have the if, you have the only if, and the question is which one would you abandon?
Mm. So you're saying either an action occurs because of a certain mental state or because of a certain physical state?
So say so if Todd goes on stream today, then he had a corresponding brain state. Or if Todd has a corresponding brain state, telling him to go on stream today, then he will.
Ah, well, this may not be satisfying to you, but I think both could be true in different contexts.
Really?
Yeah, like for example, let's say that I am in physical pain, right?
Yep.
Now I'm not thinking. I'm thinking about something else entirely, right? But let's say that I'm in physical pain, and that then leads me to the mental state that I ought to leave the condition or situation which is causing me pain. Now that mental state arguably was caused by a prior physical state, right? I did not intend to get into physical pain. It just happened for whatever reason. But that then motivates a mental state change, which then motivates a physical state change where I leave the conditions that are causing me pain.
I found the exact wording now. This will make it much easier, I think.
Okay.
Okay. So minds exist if and only if brains exist. That's it. I like that.
Well, then I reject that. Sorry.
Yeah. No,
Thank you.
absolutely.
That's
That's what I wanted to clarify. Because I'm like, something's not right here. Both of those seem like they're easy to defend. No. So you have if minds exist, then brains exist. And then you have if brains exist, then minds exists. Basically, are the two halves of that one.
that I would totally reject that. One, because I would take the position that God Himself is a disembodied mind.
Right.
Also, now, again, this is a philosophical. Okay, there are assumptions in how you analyze these claims, but throughout all of human history, men have claimed they have conversed with spirits, gods, angels, demons, whatever, disembodied spirits with an intellect. Now, I mean, you could just wave your hand like a reductive materialist and say that that doesn't exist. But this gets to another problem that I want to unpack. Well, let's talk about men who made decisions based on what we might call, prophecy, right? Like Moses claimed to have spoken to God on Mount Sinai, or some of the Greek lawgivers claimed to have conversed with the gods, who then gave them advice on how to run their society. Right? They admit that they didn't get it from themselves, and that's even the case in modern times. So, for example, Alan Moore, the graphic novelist, says he gets his ideas when he gets high and converses with this familiar spirit, which is a snake. So, I mean, the question then is, where do new ideas come from? Right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea of sui generis. Now, if you're a materialist, either reductive or epiphenomenal, it's going to be the brain states that are doing all the work, right? It's the brain states that are either identical to the mental states or are causing the mental states, and which therefore cause the physical states of you to do something as a result. Now, the epiphenomenalist can say that a prophet who either invents a religion or reforms a religion, the success of that prophet and propagating these ideas can be discussed in terms of material causality, right? His voice or the written word that he writes down, and then it just propagates that way through this material medium. So, if you could say, well, if somebody says, well, I converted because I felt the Spirit of God moving in me, the epiphenomenalist would say, well, no, you converted because you were exposed to this stimuli external to yourself, motivated, which it changed your brain states, which then changed your physical states. But that in principle cannot explain the first time it happens, because if the only way somebody could have that belief is if that person got it from a similar source, there was no similar source. It was sui generis. It was the first time. There's literally no way you explain that.
Right.
And that's why all materialism fails, because materialism can only describe a process that has already begun. It cannot explain how it starts.
Yeah. So back to the argument for a second, right? So if we think about like the branches, right? So if minds exist, then brains exist. If brains exist, then minds exist. My thinking about this one is that dualists want to reject if minds exist, then brains exist. Because transposing it would be if brains don't exist, then minds don't exist. And like we said, there could be, especially if you're say a Christian dualist, there could be non-brain having minds. And so to say that if brains don't exist, then minds don't exist, you probably want to get rid of that one.
Okay, so I think this will clarify the two kinds of dualism. Most people throughout most of history were the kind of dualists that believed there could be some sort of post-mortem mental states. The
Right.
kind of dualist you're describing would be Aristotle, right? The soul dies with the body.
Well, no. I'm describing the post-mortem ones, right? You want to say that it's false that if brains don't exist, then minds don't
No,
exist.
no, 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 no. I'm saying the different variety of choices.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That's all. That's all. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Okay. Now I understand. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, there could be an yeah, hylomorphic dualists basically. Yeah. Is that the dualism happens kind of like within the person, and then once that breaks, it's kind of done. Yeah.
Right. So
Basically how the argument goes is I looked at these two if thens, and I'm like, well, there's one that dualists want to reject. And then because there's one that dualists want to reject, I said, okay, what does it mean for it to be false? It means it's possible that the if is true and the then is false, because they're going to reject it. So they're going to have to say that's the case in some cases. And what it ended up being the case that it's possible that like brains exists but minds don't. Um when you did the analysis. And because of that, um you end up getting the possibility of philosophical zombies or NPCs, which is interesting when you think about that, because one of the biggest arguments against physicalism is the possibility of the metaphysical possibility of philosophical zombies, but the fact that dualists don't think they actually exist. Um, and so what I found was kind of consistent with that. But I'm like, if you take that seriously, and you're gonna disaffirm the proposition, um, like NPCs are physical. Like if you see a person, the person has a brain, the person looks like they have a mind, and so on. But them having a brain and whatnot isn't sufficient for them to have a mind, because it's always possible that it's false if they don't. Um, and that's the weird skepticism I found getting into dualism, is that in rejecting that one, I ended up having to bite that weird bullet. I didn't like it.
so so you're saying that the dualist has to accept that there could be philosophical zombies, i.e., people with brains but no minds?
That it's possible they could
Yeah.
be, like epistemically possible they could be. Um,
Hmm?
and that's the issue, because if it could be epistemically possible, it's like, who is it? So jokingly, I say, well, maybe it's the people that can't solve the breakfast problem, right? They're the real philosophical topics. That was my first reaction, because it's funny as hell. But in seriousness, like a belief like that could really dehumanize people. So I'm like, I don't know, maybe I'm not comfortable saying it about them, even if they are the likely candidates. I don't know who I would say it about, even if it seems like epistemically, like,
Logos, don't you mean Thomas?
don't get me started. Don't get me started. I was having such a good day. Um, yeah, but the point is, it's just like, joking aside, there's only so much to human. I wouldn't assume it of anybody, and yet it seems like rejecting one of the biconditionals of dualism, the relevant one, kind of gets me to where epistemically I kind of can't rule it out, and I probably need at least one person to make sure the if then is false. And it's like, who's going to be the scapegoat? It's like, I don't want a scapegoat. That sounds kind of crazy. And so that's where I'm like, maybe the dualism thing, not the best one. Maybe I have to come to terms with the if and only if. Maybe both just have to be true, but I have to say there's more to the story and figure out what that is. I don't know. That's the kind of thing I'm wrestling with right now. So it's not like a love for empiricism or whatever that's caused me to like shift physicalist. It's really weird thought experiments like this where I'm just like, man, this is some weird crap.
Well, to be honest, I'm not in principle opposed to philosophical zombies being epistemically possible.
Yeah.
So there's two ways you can construct this, right? Okay, so you and I, Logos, I've talked about this in private with you before. So there's a sort of like square grid where you can sort of discuss the categories of epistemology that. Oh, hold on a second. that Kant uses, right? You have a column and rows, right? So the columns are a priori and a posteriori, and the
Right.
rows are synthetic and analytic.
Yeah.
So you get 4 combinations. You get a priori analytic, you get a posteriori analytic, you've got a priori synthetic, and a priori synthetic, and then a priori analytic. One of those is actually false. It exists on the grid, but it doesn't actually exist in the world, and that's a posteriori analytic. It doesn't actually exist, but it's epistemically in that grid. So it could be that philosophical zombies are like that.
Yeah, could be.
Could be. It could also be that under a set of conditions, philosophical zombies could be real, but either they have not existed in the past, or rather, that might be too strong of a statement, they currently do not exist now.
Yeah, that would sure be convenient.
So, but also, wouldn't just a corpse be a philosophical zombie, a brain without a mind?
Well, I mean, it's assuming like brain states and mind states, and I'm assuming corpses don't really have brain states.
Well, then what about lower forms of animal life? Unless you assume they have a soul of some sort, which again, I don't think all Christians necessarily are in agreement on that.
I think we're talking about relevant human ones because we're talking about the cause of like human consciousness and whether or not. Right. So humans have mental consciousness if and only if humans have.
Okay, no, Logos, I got it.
Yeah.
You're talking about those humanoid hominids that.
Oh, don't bring up Fezzer. Don't do it.
The Fezzers.
I knew
Yes.
you were gonna do it. I knew that's the second thing I thought about right after the breakfast problem as I was writing that argument down, by the way. I thought of you. Yeah, I thought you should know that.
No, wait, you said what?
That's the second thing I thought of as I was writing that argument down. The first was the breakfast problem, people. The second was Fezzer's homunculi, right? And I grinned and thought of you as I was writing that down.
Well, no, I mean, Fezzer's okay with that. Done. We're good. We got it.
Yeah, but you're not.
No,
You're still a dualist.
Hold on. I'm not good with his explanation for the propagation of the human race. That's what I'm not good with.
Oh, okay.
The idea that such a organism could exist, that's a different question.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Well, I think we've kind of covered all the stuff that I really wanted to. I think you've definitely condensed all your hard work into a digestible presentation. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
No, I had fun. It was fun being back on stream. It's been a long time, and I hope it was helpful for everybody. And I'm sure people will disagree with me vehemently in the comments. It's going to be a good time, and hope everyone has a good day.
All right. Yes, this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.